Thank you so much for inviting me and also for being willing to listen to this talk in English. I speak French very, very poorly, so I will not subject you to my attempt to do that. And I'm particular, and as Frédéric said, this is research that is very much stemming from a new project on civic culture in late medieval Ireland and Wales. So I am very eager to hear thoughts from a multitude of perspectives on especially what citizenship means and how this might fit into a larger picture. So thank you very much. Citizenship in late medieval Europe, for much in historical scholarship for much of the 20th century, was a neglected topic. Academics who were interested in the concept of citizenship tended to be attracted towards ancient Greek and Roman formulations of political participation, or at the other end of the chronological spectrum, with post-French Revolution ideas of citizenship that conferred freedoms, political rights, and some guarantees of social welfare to members of a nation-state, as determined by a combination of birth, kinship, residence, and cultural habits. Now, in the medieval period, when a person was a citizen of a city rather than of a nation, this proved very problematic for historians who were really interested in citizenship as a category of membership that pertained to the state. And so, for example, Michael Walzer, when writing on the concept of citizenship for a 1989 volume on conceptual change in the historical longue durée, chose to skip the Middle Ages entirely, and his analysis of citizenship moved from the classical to the modern, with nary a period in between. Rogers Brubaker, writing in 1992, went so far as to describe medieval citizenship as a polar opposite to the classical and modern forms. And indeed, Brubaker saw the urban, localized model of citizenship in the European ages as a barrier to the development of citizenship proper. Citizenship of the medieval city was, in his words, quote, one of the archaic, privilege-based institutions that territorial rulers aimed to undermine or marginalize in their efforts to construct a general state citizenship, end quote. And these comparisons become particularly more complicated with the language, in that in the Middle Ages, one was a citizen of a city, but for a town, so somewhere without a cathedral, you were referred to as a burgess, even though you had basically the same privileges. So I'll be using citizen and burgess fairly interchangeably throughout this talk, and citizenship to refer to the concept of being a privileged member of an urban center. There we go. So more recently, however, medieval urban citizenship has come back into vogue. A rash of new studies in the late 2010s and even in the 2020s have stressed that there was indeed a meaningful political ideology that was attached to medieval urban citizenship. Martin Prock, in the very wide-ranging volume Citizens Without Nations of 2018, presented the urban citizenship of circa 1000 to 1789 as a set of values of localized democracy and communal responsibility that he actually says 21st century leaders would do well to adopt. These citizenship practices of the medieval and early modern period that Prock identifies included expectations that citizens would clean streets, police crime, hold political office, and pay taxes in return for the ability to influence the policies of civic government, often through voting, and the permission to exercise their trade within the town. A similar ethos pervades Christian Liddy's Politics of Citizenship from 2017, and in studying larger English towns during the years 1250 to 1530, Liddy argues that urban citizenship was predicated on the rights and obligations of members of a communitas. So citizenship required an investment of time and money in one's community, but also afforded the members of that community a sense of ownership over boundaries of the town, as well as the right to hold municipal officials account for their management of public resources. And then finally, Mary Rubin's 2020 Cities of Strangers has a slightly more pessimistic view of medieval citizenship, but she still focuses on the principle of communitas. In her survey of citizenship in European cities and towns between 1000 and 1500, she is looking at the extent to which strangers, be they traders from the hinterlands, foreign merchants, women, or Jews, she's looking at the extent to which they became integrated into European urban communities during a period of geographic mobility and economic change. And these and other excellent recent studies of late medieval urban citizenship prompt us to take urban politics in the Middle Ages seriously, both as a political ideology in its own right and as a means of examining processes of community formation in response to migration. And indeed, Mary Rubin explicitly states that Cities of Strangers from 2020 is using the Middle Ages to reflect on the treatment of Syrian refugees in the 21st century UK. My paper makes no such wide-ranging claims, I'm afraid. And I also should say I don't dispute any of those conclusions drawn by those scholars whose work has been really influential to my own thinking. What I do want to do, though, is widen our approach to urban citizenship in the Middle Ages beyond community, beyond communitas. When individuals became citizens of a city or town, I will argue, their reasons for adopting this status sometimes actually had little to do with becoming a member of a particular urban community. Urban citizenship brought with it the right to trade toll-free in other towns, and could also be a helpful tool for consolidating political and economic power in the countryside. And at times, as we shall see, urban citizenship could also enable the holder, in the cases that I'll be looking at, to project an English ethnic identity that could prove useful in a variety of contexts outside the town in which they were citizens. Urban citizenship was thus an outward-facing status as much as a local one, understood to embed the holder in social, political, and cultural hierarchies external to the town, as well as enshrining their place within the particular local community of which they were a citizen. So to illustrate these outward-facing aspects of urban citizenship, I'm going to be using examples from towns in Ireland and Wales during the 14th and 15th centuries. Sorry, I realize I've probably made the maps too big. Firstly, so why these examples? Well, firstly, the status of Ireland and Wales in the later Middle Ages as politically fragmented territories under loose English rule meant that those seeking citizenship of Irish or Welsh towns were often doing so in reference to an especially complex tangle of relationships, jurisdictions, and identities. And now I'm going to take you through a very, very quick history of late medieval Wales and Ireland to situate those who aren't familiar with what's going on. It is quite complicated, I do warn you. So to start with Wales, which we have here on your left, in the aftermath of the Norman conquest of 1066, Anglo-Norman lords pushed into western and southern Wales to establish what were called marcher lordships, which were part of the English king's dominions, but were actually exempt from most of his laws, because they're essentially ruled as semi-autonomous aristocratic lordships. So on your screen, those are the areas that are in white. Those are the marcher lordships. And these Anglo-Norman lords in the 11th and 12th centuries established towns in these lordships under their control in Wales, and granted rights of citizenship to attract settlers, and it drew in English, French, Flemish, and even some indigenous Welsh migrants to buy newly created burgess plots and become burgesses there. Now, in 1277 to 83, so a little bit later, King Edward I of England completes the conquest of Wales by defeating the final indigenous Prince of Wales, and then taking that title and using it for his son, as has happened ever since. And after that conquest, Edward I set up a series of heavily fortified royal towns in North Wales, so the bits that are striped, North and West Wales, and the bits that are striped on your map. And these had somewhat similar rules to towns in the Marcher lordships, but tended to have stricter provisions forbidding the indigenous Welsh from becoming burgesses of the towns in these royal areas. Ireland, if we move to our other map, has a somewhat similar story in that it came under English jurisdiction during the Middle Ages, but like Wales, multiple types of authority remained the norm in the region. So Ireland was partially conquered by Anglo-Norman lords on their own initiative in 1169, indeed the descendants of many of the same lords who had conquered Wales earlier. And then an invasion by King Henry II of England in 1171 established English royal authority over, in claim, all of the island, in practice, some of the island. And English authority was really largely confined to the eastern and southern coasts of Ireland, and in particular to urban areas, which were almost entirely resettled with new English and continental European migrants. In the late 14th and 15th centuries, though, the period that I'm going to be looking at, the English government really struggled to exert power in Ireland consistently, and royal investment in the colony decreased. So the result was that really the area around Dublin is the one where the English crown is exercising firm control. But all of the bit in the west here, where you see the O'Connors, the O'Briens, all that area is really controlled by indigenous Gaelic Irish lords. And you'll see some striped areas in the middle of your map. And during the late 14th and 15th century, the descendants of the Anglo-Norman lords who had conquered Ireland in the 12th century, they start to adopt a lot of Gaelic Irish cultural habits, like fostering their children, sponsoring bardic poetry, etc., and really operate those areas practically independently from English rule and according to a mixed series of English and Irish laws. So, you don't need to remember all that, but basically the point to take, I think, is that in this context of jurisdictional and cultural plurality, urban citizenship was not going to be a fixed or static concept. And those adopting it were probably aware that the rights it conveyed had to operate in multiple geographic areas, and that they were sending messages to multiple audiences. And for that reason, I think looking at Irish and Welsh towns for a study in 1300 to 1500 for a study of urban citizenship is especially apt, and especially if we're considering it as an outward-facing form of identity and rights. The other reason that it's proved quite interesting to look at Ireland and Wales in the context of urban citizenship is that they have a very different source base to what we would find for Flemish, Italian, German, French, or other continental European towns, or even English towns. In terms of sort of municipal archives, so the records that urban governments are producing themselves, there's really very little. Ireland is relatively well-stocked, as it were. Dublin, the capital and largest city in Ireland, has left behind 2 14th century books of customary law, a roll of ordinances made by the Dublin Assembly that dates from 1447 onwards, and there's a register of individuals admitted as citizens of Dublin from 1468. Other Irish cities have some records of ordinances, but they're patchier, so Waterford, Kilkenny, and Galway provide some evidence. But we're certainly not looking at the amount of documentation that I'm used to that you would get for somewhere like London. And Wales, there are even fewer late medieval municipal archives. And you're really working extensively from rolls of the urban courts that are found amongst the records of aristocratic lordships to which the towns were subject. So Carnarvon and most famously Rephin, which you see here on your screen, have quite a full set of those. But because we don't kind of have the traditional municipal archive evidence, it means that you have to look to other sources like charters, property deeds, and lawsuits in royal and aristocratic archives. And this actually, I think, forces you to think a bit differently about citizenship, because you're not seeing the municipal government telling its own story of urban community and citizens needing to perform certain responsibilities and getting certain rights in return. But instead, because we have to look at sources that aren't stemming from the urban government itself, we have a different lens. So they're sources that are less likely to be concerned with the internal politics of the town and the responsibilities required of community members, and instead more interested in the rights that citizenship conveyed outside the town and how this status was perceived by those who weren't part of that urban political community. So with all of that intro out of the way, now for the main bits. So what were the mechanisms for obtaining citizenship in medieval Irish and Welsh towns? As you may have guessed from my survey of the evidence here, we know the most about Dublin, where procedures were pretty similar to those that I've encountered in English towns that I've studied for the same period. So you could become a citizen of Dublin, firstly, if the mayor, bailiff, or other senior civic official nominates you, and that's called becoming a citizen by special grace. You could also gain this status by serving a 7-year apprenticeship with an existing citizen. And in addition, citizenship could be inherited by the sons or daughters of citizens. Although in Dublin, a citizen couldn't have all of their offspring become citizens. They had to pick and choose 1 or 2 that would inherit the status. Widows of citizens inherited their husband's status, and men could also become citizens of a town by marrying female citizens, so women who already had that status. And typically, someone entering the citizenship of Dublin would pay a one-off fine of 12 pence or 1 shilling as the cost of entry. But very frequently, this was waived, especially for people who became citizens by the special grace of the mayor and officials. We know a lot less about citizenship criteria in other Irish towns, but surviving records we do have for Waterford, Kilkenny, and Galway suggest that similar measures were in place there. For example, ordinances from Waterford in the mid-15th century show that widows were actually required to become citizens on the death of their husbands, and that men could become citizens after marrying a female citizen or the wife or daughter of a citizen. So Welsh towns, then, which tended to be much smaller than the likes of Dublin or Kilkenny or Galway, had a rather different procedure for becoming citizens. In most Welsh towns, you became a burgess by acquiring a burgage plot in the town. And a burgage plot They're essentially long, narrow strips of land that are laid out in a town in all of the same size mostly, so quite uniform plots, and then leased out for an annual fee of 12 pence or 1 shilling. So in Wales then, citizenship was thus tied to landholding rather than to apprenticeship or to the wishes of the civic elite. Many Welsh boroughs were also under the lordship of aristocrats, and in those cases, the lord of the town could also ask/demand that individuals who had served him loyally be made a citizen of one of the towns under his control. For the records we have for Ruthin, Reginald Lord Grey of Ruthin in the early 15th century does this fairly frequently with ordering people who've served in his military retinue to be made citizens of Ruthin. And one of the reasons that Lord Grey of Ruthin wanted to do this so much is that it was a money-making scheme for him. In one instance, in 1405, he charged Ewan ap Gronwy Goff from the royal comet of Docphalion £6 to become a citizen, which is a huge amount of money in the 15th century. Some towns, such as Oswestry in 1408, eventually switched to a system more similar to what we have in Ireland, where the leading officers of the town are allowed to make their own rules about who becomes a citizenship, and where it's less explicitly tied to land tenure. But despite these variations, the basic outline of citizenship in Irish and Welsh towns would have been that familiar throughout most of Europe. Those becoming citizens or burgesses were required to take an oath at a public assembly, swearing that they would be in lot and scot with the community of the town, meaning that they would make all required financial contributions to sustain civic defense and infrastructure. Wales, we almost certainly have something very similar. And ordinances that were passed by the Waterford Assembly in the late 14th and 15th centuries make it clear that individuals were expected to be established members of the community before becoming citizens, with a rule in place requiring that they be 3 years a householder within the said city, so that the civic government could, quote, know their good governance and conversation before they applied for citizen status. And once they became citizens of Waterford, they were expected to keep the city of Waterford as their principal residence, to attend all council meetings when summoned, and to accept civic office if elected. And in return for demonstrating this commitment to the community's welfare, they also had a privileged status within the town. So they could participate in the election of officials, they were exempt from outside jurisdictions, and had the exclusive right to buy and sell goods freely in the town's market. So what I've described there for Ireland and Wales is what you'll find in almost all of Europe in this period, and fits with that communitas model by Prock and Liddy that I was discussing earlier, of citizens of towns gaining certain rights in response but in return having certain responsibilities towards the community that they have to fulfill. But this is really only one aspect of urban citizenship that I've seen in operation in my studies of late medieval Ireland and Wales. Many people would have sought citizenship less for the rights it gained them within the town, and more for the rights that it afforded them outside the community. A standard privilege granted by charter to towns in England, as well as in Ireland and Wales, was that if you were a citizen or burgess of a town, you had the right to trade in all other towns under the English king's dominions, be they in England, Ireland, Wales, Normandy, or Gascony, without paying any additional tolls that might be exacted by the civic authorities. And we can see in our records that this aspect of urban citizenship is a kind of passport to other towns was very highly prized. In 1456, Dublin's civic government passed an ordinance that required all English merchants who wanted to be tax exempt when trading in Dublin to bring with them a written certificate from their own civic government proving that they were a citizen, and thus could again claim this sort of bilateral urban passport, as it were. And Dublin's franchise roll, which lists everyone admitted as a citizen of Dublin between 1468 and 1512, actually has a series of membranes towards the end where we see the Dublin city clerk writing down all of these particular certificates that they're receiving from London and Bristol and Coventry merchants claiming that right to trade toll-free in Dublin. And they're so detailed that they even name the particular folio on which the original grant of the freedom in London, in the London letter books, was recorded. And similarly in Wales, in the town of Beaumaris, the bailiffs there in 1355 implement a policy of securing transcripts of charters from a whole variety of English, Welsh, and Irish towns, just to make sure that people who are claiming tax-exempt status when trading in Beaumaris are doing so legitimately and are actually citizens of their hometowns in the way that they've claimed. And most importantly, urban citizenship provided merchants with the ability to call on the assistance of their civic government when their right to toll-free commerce in another town was not respected. And the document you see here is from a case in 1383 when Alan de Botolph and John Atwall, who were burgesses of Conwy in Wales, they were charged tolls while they were trading in the Irish town of Drogheda. And irate at being charged these tolls that they thought as burgesses of Conwy they should not have to pay, they called upon the whole community of burgesses of Conwy to send a letter patent to the mayor of Drogheda to ensure that such encroachments on their trading privileges never occurred again. And this is far from being a unique incident. These sorts of communications happened all the time in the 14th and 15th century, where civic governments are brought in to defend the rights of their citizens when they're not respected, when they're trading further afield. So one of the attractions of citizenship to merchants was undoubtedly this potential to harness the legal and political support of a civic government should their business affairs in other towns go sour. Also, evidence from Irish and Welsh towns in the late medieval period stresses the extent to which communal responsibilities of urban citizenship were actually often divorced from its commercial privileges. And there are a large variety of citizens who opt out of the political side of citizenship entirely. Dublin had special arrangements with London and Bristol that allowed citizens of those English towns to automatically become citizens of Dublin, should they wish. And between 1474 and 1497, we have several citizens of London and one citizen of Bristol who take up this offer. So it wasn't just theoretical. And those who gained citizenship of Dublin through this transferable mechanism of being a citizen of London or Bristol, they were known as free foreigners, and they were allowed to exercise commercial freedoms from tolls, but it was confirmed in 1462 that they were to have no voice in civic elections, so they're economic citizens only. And what's interesting is that this idea of non-political citizenship seems to be one that the Dublin civic government encouraged rather than discouraged. In 1500, the civic government makes Michael Braun a citizen of Dublin, but only on the condition that he exercised that privilege only when he wasn't living in the city. And they make exactly the same stipulations for Richard Bagot the next year, so that they say you can have this toll-free status when you leave Dublin, but we don't want you exercising political rights within the city itself. The Irish city of Waterford similarly had a category of partial citizens called censors, who lived outside the city and paid an annual sum for the course of their lives to possess the economic benefits of citizens. And a 1466 ordinance referred to censors as, quote, free for term of life as well within lands as without to pass the sea, end quote, suggesting that they were entitled to the toll-free privileges of urban citizenship, not only within Waterford itself, but also in all of those other towns in outside Ireland where urban citizens were exempt from additional payments. And we see a fairly similar phenomenon in Wales, where actually a lot of Welsh boroughs derive significant portions of their income from a category known as censors, who are also known as Burgenses de Vento, which translates very poetically into burgesses of the wind. And these are citizens who do not hold burgage plots or maintain residence within the town, but again, pay an annual sum to be allowed to trade in the same manner as burgesses of that town and without paying additional tolls. And the understanding in such cases was that these burgesses of the wind didn't have the right to participate in policy making, but also weren't burdened with with having to hold office or having to attend meetings or participate in those other communal aspects of that we typically think of with urban citizenship. And the other interesting thing to note here is that Dublin, but also other Irish towns and other Welsh towns that we have evidence for, tend to feature an unusually large number of women among their citizens. And women were also partial citizens of this type, in that they had trading rights, but they didn't have voting rights, and they weren't allowed to hold civic office, and they weren't responsible for military defense. So as a comparison, the records we have of Dublin citizens in the late 15th century show that 18% were female. In the English city of York, over the same time period, it's 0.5%. So we're looking at a considerable difference. And ordinances, and we have many ordinances for Waterford and Kilkenny concerning the terms under which women could become citizens of those Irish towns, which shows that it's something that happened frequently enough for there to be a lot of legislation about it. And Welsh towns as well, that we have records for, there's I can't think of any Welsh towns that have records of burgesses where there are no women, and they're often making up to sort of a third of the citizenry, so still a fairly high percentage. So when we take these categories of subsidiary citizenship into account, we can see that urban citizenship was only partially tied to membership of a social and political community. Plenty of people exercised its privileges without partaking in its obligations. And moreover, one of the other attractive aspects of urban citizenship was again that fact that you were able to trade in other towns more easily, that it's this transferable right that gives you essentially access to a wider economic network. So I've talked mostly about merchants so far, but urban citizenship was also prized because it enabled wealthy rural landholders to sell agricultural produce without paying extra fees, and it afforded them the opportunity to influence the rules that operated in the urban markets where their goods were sold. This picture of good government in the countryside, I should note, is very obviously not Ireland or Wales. This is from the Lorenzetti fresco in Siena. So yes, if this looked awfully nice and sunny and Italian, that's because it is. And It's striking that, again, for the Dublin lists we have, there are far fewer artisans than you would expect, but a large number of people described as yeomen or husbandmen, which are occupations that suggest people who owned and operated farms. And work by Geroid McNichol and Kieran Hoare has demonstrated that while Irish civic governments do involve merchants, the elites that are governing these towns tend to derive most of their wealth from their landed estates outside the city, rather than from international trade or industrial production. And this was even more strikingly the case in Welsh boroughs, where possession of citizenship often brought with it not just economic rights within the town concerned, but also a monopoly over trade in the surrounding hinterland. Burgesses of Brecon are the only people who are allowed to trade in the wider lordship that the town was the centre of. And similarly, burgesses of Neath in Wales were the only ones who were allowed to conduct commerce in the whole lordship. And interestingly, we see in a 1380 charter that the burgesses for the small Welsh town of Lampeter, they gain the rights to use the land in the surrounding countryside as pasture for their animals whenever they want. And they are also given the right to take wood for their own use from forests nearby whenever they want. And we see similar provisions for the town of Denbigh and other places in Wales. So in both this Irish and Welsh context, it may well be that one of the real attractive qualities of urban citizenship had nothing to do with the city at all, and was really because it gave you the opportunity to build up your rural estates and control the hinterlands more securely. And we see that this is suggested as well by the fact that in Irish and Welsh towns, frequently people holding office are both mayor of, say, Dublin or mayor of Carnarvon, but at the same time are serving as royal sheriffs for the rural surrounding county. Which is something that in English towns you don't tend to see. There's more of a separation of urban and non-urban office in that context. And urban citizenship as well was really, one of its key functions was as a device for political networking and the consolidation of family power. And we see this particularly in, again, Dublin, where the mayor and other civic officers, as I said earlier, had extensive discretion to admit new citizens through special grace, meaning that they didn't have to meet the usual rules of birth, apprenticeship, or marriage that would have required a more demonstrable commitment and attachment to the urban community. So this, by special grace, you can basically make anyone a citizen who you want and ignore the usual standards you'd use to see that someone was invested in the locality. And in Dublin, between 1468 and 1512, 44% of new citizens gain that status through the special grace of city officials, compared to 40% through apprenticeship. So we're actually looking at a very large number who don't need to go by the normal rules. And there's also a tendency for mayors and senior civic officers to make very powerful political figures citizens through special grace. So these included, for example, John, Earl of Worcester, royal officials in Ireland, and secretaries to the Deputy Lord Lieutenant, who's the most powerful, who's the representative of royal government for all of Ireland. And in Dublin, there are also 35 members of the clergy who become citizens. And both for the clergy and these aristocrats and these royal officials, it's very unlikely that they would have been expected to hold civic office, to pay civic taxes, to clean the streets, to do those communal responsibilities. And we see the same trends in the Irish city of Kilkenny, where we only have records for 1 year of citizenship admissions in 1383 to 4, but they include the Bishop of Ossory and the Earl of Ormond. And to go back to Dublin, part of this special grace strategy for creating political networks through citizenship was to make as many female members of your family citizens as possible. And we have, in addition to women becoming citizens as daughters or widows of Dublin citizens, many gain this through special grace. And we even see situations where there are some very dubious apprenticeships that are created to allow wider political to allow women from wider political networks, women from extended families to become citizens of Dublin. My favorite example of this is in the 1480s. Two women, Margaret Birmingham and Rose Braun, are listed as achieving citizenship of Dublin because they were apprentices to Philip Birmingham, who was Chief Justice of the King's Bench in Ireland. And while women do lots of wonderful economic activities in the 15th century, the idea that they're training to be the leading judge in Ireland seems unlikely and a legal fiction that's being brought in. And it seems here that in Dublin, urban citizenship is being used as a dowry for daughters of the mayors and bailiffs and for female relations of friends and allies. Because you could gain citizenship of Dublin through marriage to a female citizen. And thus, urban citizenship could make a woman a much more desirable marriage partner and hence give her the potential to attract a husband of a higher status who might desire some of the trading privileges that came with citizenship. This is something that's new to me, and I haven't done the required sort of in-depth prosopographical analysis to reconstruct some of these political networks, but I think it's definitely worth doing and something that at this stage is sort of suggestive and interesting. And then lastly, having gone through far too much tedious detail about trading rights, I want to explore the ways in which urban citizenship took on the element of an ethnic signifier in late medieval Ireland and Wales. So a means by which individuals could assert their Englishness during a period when the Crown viewed the political loyalties of anyone in Ireland and Wales as suspect. The 14th and 15th centuries in Ireland are often referred to as a period of Gaelicization, in which Gaelic Irish lords gained control of more people and territory, and in which descendants of Anglo-Norman settlers often adopted Gaelic cultural habits, dress, and language. And at the same time, especially in the 15th century, larger and larger numbers of Gaelic Irish begin moving into towns, becoming apprentices, and seeking citizenship. And in Wales, we see this same dynamic of perhaps lessening English control and more indigenous Welsh wanting to become citizens of towns. Most famously, the separatist revolt of the indigenous Welsh noble Owain Glendower in 1400 to 1409 saw most towns in Wales, they're besieged, burnt down, many fall to the rebels temporarily. And this is a huge, the revolt subsides, the English regain control, but tensions between Welsh and English, particularly centered on towns, still exist. And in 1350 to 1500, again, we see more and more indigenous Welsh wanting to become burgesses of Welsh towns, in part. And this shift from English to Welsh in the population is perhaps coming from the fact that after the Black Death and after this massive revolt, Welsh towns have fewer people and are less economically productive for the English, so a lot of them lose interest and move elsewhere. So we have a really interesting situation then in 1350 to 1500 in Ireland and Wales, where urban elites they want to ensure that townspeople are loyal to English interests and would willingly defend them by force in these times of political turmoil. But at the same time, they don't want to drive away people of Gaelic or Welsh heritage whose presence is essential to keep the town going, to keep its demographic and economic vitality. And the result was that at a municipal level, policies in Ireland and Wales emerge of associating urban citizenship with Englishness very publicly, while at the same time taking very few practical measures to restrict the admission of Indigenous Welsh or Gaelic Irish individuals to the franchise. In the 14th century, Welsh boroughs such as Hope secured charters that explicitly forbid Welshmen from becoming burgesses, while a charter to Newton in South Wales more obliquely states that all Englishmen who have burgage plots will be regarded as burgesses and have the right to toll-free trade. And these kinds of local measures are then extended much more widely by the English Parliament in 1401 and 1402 in response to the Glendower revolts that I was mentioning earlier, in which Welsh, and by these statutes, all Welsh were forbidden from becoming burgesses of any towns in Wales or along England's border with Wales. And also burgess status would be removed from any English burgess who married a Welsh woman. So again, we can really see gender and marriage intersecting quite closely with citizenship. But even with all of these regulations, the proportion of Indigenous Welsh burgesses increases rather than decreases in the 15th century. And we may see why when we look at documents such as the one I have here, which is a confirmation of privileges to the burgesses of Brecon in Wales in 1411. And this charter grants privileges of citizenship. It's confirming the privileges of burgesses to 86 named individuals who it declares to be English, and it says that they regard those 86 individuals as English and grant those rights to those people's heirs who are English on both their father and mother's sides. But several of the 86 burgesses who are listed here have Welsh surnames or Welsh-style patronymics that suggests that a complete absence of Welsh heritage was unlikely. So we have a Thomas ap Dafydd, a Llewellyn ap Iefan ap Llewellyn, a Ludwig ap Howell, John ap Rhys ap David, etc. So in essence then, it appears as if Brecon was declaring that anyone who was a burgess of the town was going to be regarded as English for all intents and purposes, even if those people also had some Welsh ancestry, but that burgess and English are being regarded as citizens, as synonyms. And this ability to assert claims to Englishness through urban citizenship would have been especially useful in 1411. So because it's not long after the Glendower revolt. And this is a period when the English city of Chester, which is the key center for Welsh trade in England, has rules that restrict entry into the town of Welsh people in order to keep military, in order to prevent the town being, in order to prevent spying, essentially. So being able to say that you're a burgess of Brecon and burgesses are English is something that might be helpful if you have a bit of Welsh blood in you. And in Ireland, similarly, during the 15th century, several civic governments pass ordinances that forbid people of Gaelic Irish blood or political sympathies from becoming citizens or apprentices. And these stipulations often coincided with ordinances requiring English behavior of burgesses. So in 1469 to 70, the city of Waterford made becoming a member of the citizenry conditional on proof that the recipient was, quote, of English array, habit, and speech, end quote. And in 1477 to 8, they made explicit that if you're a constable of Waterford, you needed to be able to speak good English, wear English array, and that this English array needed to be made from English cloth. So the number of, Englishness very key here. But nevertheless, as Sparky Booker has shown recently, the number of individuals with Gaelic Irish surnames who become citizens of Dublin or Waterford increase in the 15th century at exactly the same time as these types of measures, as these types of ordinances are being passed. And we see from the private correspondence of the Blake family in Galway that it was very common for burgesses of Irish towns to do business with Gaelic Irish lords and to adopt Gaelic Irish naming patterns and customs when it suited them. So the ordinances made by Irish civic governance about English heritage, behavior, speech, and dress may have been attempts to reassure the outside world rather than serious endeavors to impose English uniformity within Irish towns themselves. Merchants from Irish towns were regarded with suspicion in England during this period. They were even classified as aliens by the 1439 to 40 parliamentary legislation. And in the 15th century, the English town of Bristol, which is really the center of Irish trade in England, tries to limit the ability of people born in Ireland to become citizens of Bristol or to hold office there. So urban citizenship in Ireland and Wales then was a method by which people, whether they were of English heritage or not, could associate themselves with cultural Englishness and try to increase their trustworthiness when they're trading in English towns. I know I've taken up far too much of your time already, so to conclude, I think it's only part of the story to see urban citizenship in the later Middle Ages as principally about membership of a local community, in which economic and political rights were conferred in exchange for responsibilities to contribute to the welfare of that particular community, whether that be through removing rubbish from the street outside one's house, holding civic office when called upon to do so, or keeping a weapon to be used in defense of the community. The Irish and Welsh examples demonstrate that significant proportions of citizens and burgesses were exempt or excluded from duties of service to the community. Some undoubtedly saw urban citizenship principally in terms of the advantages it could convey outside the town, whether that be through toll exemptions when trading in other towns, access to resources in the rural hinterlands, opportunities to improve the marriage prospects of their daughters, or asserting a claim to English identity. Now, the specific status of Ireland and Wales in the 14th and 15th century as areas under the dominion of the English crown, but in which English royal power often coexisted in practice with autonomous aristocratic lordships and large indigenous power bases, those special conditions may mean that urban citizenship was particularly outward-looking and particularly flexible in this context. But I still think that the basic principle I've tried to articulate, however unclearly and poorly, in this paper, so the principle that urban citizenship was again not just rooted in the local political community, but was a legal status that embedded the holder in a variety of other social, economic, and political networks. I think that probably holds true for most towns. And that's where I'm really eager to hear your thoughts and the different contexts that you may be working on to see if they agree with or contradict the findings that I have so far.
Thank you very much. Might be warm.